Welcome, Boot, to the Deep Dive. Today we are going to be trying something just a little bit different. You've asked for a deep dive that takes a more philosophical look at behaviorism, and so that's what we're going to be doing today. We'll be exploring behaviorism by taking a close look at a 1913 article by John B. Watson. It's called Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It.
Now, this is going to be a fascinating choice because this article, it's not just some dry scientific paper or treatise or something. It's more like a philosophical manifesto. It's one that challenges how we understand the mind, how we understand behavior even.
And that's what's really so exciting about this deep dive, I think. We're not just, learning the basics of behaviorism. We're going to be asking some of the biggest questions in philosophy, like what is consciousness even? What's the relationship between our minds and our bodies? How much control do we actually have over our actions? Those kinds of things.
And this article by Watson, it's really a great place to start asking these sorts of questions because from the very beginning, he's sort of throwing down the gauntlet. He says straight up that he rejects the idea that consciousness should be the primary focus of psychology. He argues that it's too subjective, it's too unreliable to be studied scientifically.
Yeah, he actually compares the psychology of his time to biology before Darwin came along. Before Darwin, everything was interpreted in terms of human evolution. It was very human-centric view of the natural world. And Watson says that psychology was making the same mistake by being too focused on human consciousness.
And I think that analogy is brilliant because it helps us understand that radical shift in thinking that Watson is proposing. You see, before Darwin, biologists saw the world as this hierarchy with humans at the top, the most evolved and important beings. But Darwin, he challenged this view. He showed that humans are just one branch on this giant tree of life, connected to all other species through evolution.
So is Watson essentially saying that psychology needs its own Darwinian revolution? That it needs to shift away from this human-centric view of consciousness and move toward a more objective, a more scientific understanding of behavior across all species?
Exactly. That's exactly it. He's saying that instead of trying to peer into this, black box of consciousness, we should focus on what we can actually observe and measure. He believes that by studying the relationship between stimuli and responses, we can begin to uncover the laws that govern behavior, just like physicists uncover the laws that govern motion and gravity.
And so that's where we get to the heart of behaviorism, right? This idea that all behavior, no matter how complex, can ultimately be explained as a series of learned associations between stimuli and responses.
Yeah, and it's a really powerful idea that has had a profound impact on how we think about learning motivation, even personality.
But it's not without its critics. Even back in 1913, people were questioning whether behaviorism could really account for all the richness and complexity of human experience.
And one of the biggest challenges to behaviorism back then was the question of introspection. I mean, for centuries, philosophers, psychologists, they had relied on introspection, looking inward at their own thoughts and feelings as this primary way of understanding the mind.
Right, but Watson rejects introspection completely as a valid scientific method. He argues that it's too subjective, it's too unreliable. He says that different people can have wildly different interpretations of the same internal experience, and so it's impossible to build a consistent science on such shaky foundations.
He even points out that very experienced psychologists would often disagree on the meaning of basic terms, like what is a sensation, what exactly is an image, and if the experts can't even agree on what these terms mean, how can we expect to build a science of the mind on introspection?
So Watson sees introspection as a dead end for the field. He wants psychology to move beyond these subjective methods and embrace the rigor of the natural sciences. He wants it to focus on observable behavior that can be measured and tested.
And to sort of illustrate this point, he uses this really compelling example in his article. He talks about studying the behavior of birds, and he says that instead of trying to guess what might be going on inside a bird's mind, we should focus on what it actually does, how it builds its nest, how it searches for food, how it reacts to predators.
So it's a shift from asking, what is the bird thinking, to asking, what is the bird doing and why is it doing it? And by focusing on these observable behaviors, Watson thinks we can begin to understand the relationship between stimuli in the environment and the responses of the organism.
And this focus on stimuli and responses, this is key to understanding the predictive power that behaviorism offers. If we know what stimuli trigger certain behaviors, we can potentially predict those behaviors and even control them by manipulating the environment.
So like if we understand that a certain reward system is encouraging a specific behavior, we could theoretically use that reward system to shape someone's actions.
Yeah, that's a really powerful concept.
That's a very powerful concept.
And it raises all sorts of ethical questions about, the possibility of manipulation and control. But Watson saw this predictive power as a strength of behaviorism. He believed that by understanding these laws of behavior, we could create better educational systems, we could design better therapies for mental illness, and even build more just and equitable societies.
But even if we say, okay, behavior can be predicted and controlled, can we really explain all aspects of human experience in terms of stimuli and responses? Like, what about things like imagination or judgment or reasoning? Can those really be reduced to just behavioral patterns?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a question that behaviorists have been wrestling with since the very beginning. Even Watson acknowledged that certain mental processes were definitely more challenging to explain from a purely behavioral point of view.
He didn't shy away, though, from these tough questions. In fact, he proposed a pretty radical idea about how even thought processes could be understood within this behaviorist framework.
Yeah, and this is where things get really interesting.
He suggested that thought processes might actually be physical reactions, specifically tiny muscle movements in the larynx.
It might sound kind of out there at first, I guess, but it's actually a very logical extension of his core idea that all behavior, even these internal mental processes, can ultimately be understood as physical responses to stimuli.
Wow, so even our inner monologues, those silent conversations we have with ourselves, could be seen as a kind of behavior. That's a mind-blowing concept.
It is. It really pushes us to reconsider what we even mean by behavior and how broadly we can apply these principles to understanding the human experience. Yeah, it really does challenge us to think about whether thinking itself, this thing we see as intangible and internal, might actually have a physical side to it.
So Watson's kind of blurring the lines between the mind and the body. He's saying the mind isn't this separate, ethereal thing, but more like an extension of our physical selves.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. And it leads to some really interesting questions about the nature of consciousness and how our thoughts are connected to our actions.
Let's shift gears a bit, though, for a minute and talk about the practical side of behaviorism. Watson wasn't just all about theory. He thought behaviorism could be used to solve real-world problems, especially in education.
He was a huge advocate for what we now call active learning. He felt like a lot of traditional teaching methods were too focused on just memorizing things and abstract concepts. Watson argued for a more hands-on kind of experiential approach where students are really engaged in the learning process.
So instead of just sitting there listening to lectures, they'd be doing experiments, solving problems, and applying what they learned to real-life situations.
Exactly. He believed that by making learning relevant and engaging, you could create more effective and more enjoyable educational experiences.
And this approach has definitely stuck around in education, especially when it comes to early childhood development.
Absolutely. We understand now that little kids learn best through playing exploration and hands-on activities rather than just traditional classroom instruction. Watson was way ahead of his time when he saw how important the environment is to shape behavior and how important active learning is.
Now, education was a big focus for Watson, but he also thought you could apply these behaviorist principles to other areas, like advertising and marketing.
It's really fascinating how Watson understood that behaviorism could be used to influence not just individuals, but entire systems.
So we're talking not just about like getting someone to buy a specific product or learn a new skill, but about shaping public opinion, promoting social change, even influencing government policies.
Precisely, and that's when the ethical considerations become even more important. When you have the power to shape behavior on such a massive scale, you have to be really careful about how you use it.
Yeah, because while behaviorism can definitely be used for good, it can also be used to manipulate and control people. It's a double-edged sword.
And that's exactly why it's so crucial to have these philosophical discussions alongside the scientific advancements in the field. We need to think critically about what could happen as a result of these ideas and develop ethical frameworks for how to use them.
It's like we need some behaviorism guardrails to make sure this powerful tool isn't misused. We have to be aware of the potential for manipulation and make sure that using these principles respects individual choice and helps the common good.
That's a great way to put it. It's about finding a balance between using behaviorism for positive change and protecting people from its potential downsides.
This brings us to another important part of Watson's thinking, his emphasis on studying behavior in all kinds of species. He believed that to really get human behavior, you had to look beyond just humans and study behavior in the bigger picture of biology.
He argued that focusing only on human consciousness would create a kind of bias that limited our understanding of behavior.
So instead of assuming human consciousness is totally unique and special, Watson's saying we need to look for what's similar across species, the basic principles that drive behavior, whether it's a human or a rat, pressing a lever for a reward.
Exactly. By doing that, we can better understand the evolutionary roots of behavior and how those mechanisms are still at work in us today.
That's a wild thought. The same stuff that makes a pigeon peck a button for food could be part of our own complex decision-making.
It shows just how connected all living things really are. Even with our differences, we share a common heritage that shapes our behavior.
But if we're going to study behavior across different species, we need a way to do it objectively and measurably. And that's where Watson's focus on observable behavior instead of introspection comes in.
He argued that you can't rely on introspection or what people say when studying animals. You have to focus on what you can see and measure, looking at their actions, how they react to things, and how those responses change over time.
So instead of trying to guess what a rat's thinking or feeling, we should focus on how it acts in different situations, how it learns new stuff, and how rewards and punishments affect its behavior.
Exactly. That's where the power of experiments comes in. By carefully setting up the environment and changing specific factors, we can start to figure out the rules that govern behavior both in humans and other animals.
But even if we can see and measure behavior, how do we know we're understanding it the right way? Isn't there still some room for bias in how we interpret what we observe?
You're right. It's a challenge scientists in all fields always deal with. But by designing experiments carefully, making sure other things aren't affecting the results, and repeating the same findings in different studies, we can be more sure that we're accurately capturing and interpreting the behavior.
So it's not just about watching. It's about setting up checks and balances to make sure what we think is happening is based on real evidence.
Exactly. It's about applying the scientific method rigorously to understand behavior, this super complex thing that affects so much of our lives.
And even with all that science, there's still something about behaviorism that feels kind of unsettling. You know, it's like the idea that we're just a bunch of conditioned responses, that our past experiences and our surroundings determine what we do. It makes you wonder if we really have free will at all.
It definitely challenges what we think about free will and how much control we actually have. And that's where the philosophical debate gets really interesting.
Because if we're all just products of our environment, what does that mean for personal responsibility? Can we hold people accountable for what they do if it's all just a result of conditioning?
That's a question that has huge implications for our legal system, our moral beliefs, even our personal relationships. If behavior is just cause and effect, what happens to our sense of agency and moral responsibility?
Yeah, it's a tough question for sure. But yeah, I think it's important to remember that behaviorism isn't saying there's no such thing as free will. It's more like it's saying our choices are shaped by things we might not even realize.
Right? It's recognizing that we're not just making decisions in a void. Our behavior comes from this mix of our genes, our past experiences, and our current environment. And when we understand those things, it helps us make better choices and create environments that support good behavior.
So it's not like behaviorism is this force that takes away our free will. We can see it as a way to understand ourselves better and the things that affect what we do. We might not always be totally in control, but that doesn't mean we can't change our lives or make a difference in the world.
It's a really good point. It's both empowering and humbling at the same time. It reminds us that we're part of this big web of interconnected things, but within that web, we still have the power to make choices and shape our own path, even if there are some limits.
It's a cool paradox, and it brings us back to that idea of Darwin and how we moved away from seeing humans as the center of everything. Just like Darwin showed us that humans are part of a bigger ecosystem, behaviorism shows us that our behavior is shaped by this whole network of things both inside and outside of us.
And just like understanding evolution helps us appreciate how diverse and connected life is, understanding behaviorism can help us appreciate how complex human nature is and all the things that affect our thoughts, feelings, and actions.
It reminds us that we're not just individuals making choices on our own. We're part of a bigger system, a web of relationships and things that shape who we are and how we act.
And being aware of that is really powerful. It can help us make better choices about how we live, how we treat others, and how we impact the world around us.
So as we finish up this deep dive into behaviorism, I want to leave you with a few final thoughts.
First, remember that behaviorism isn't just some boring theory. It's a set of ideas that have really shaped our lives, from how we teach kids, to how we design cities, to how we understand ourselves.
Second, don't be afraid to question these ideas. Behaviorism, like any science or philosophy, has limits and people who disagree with it. Think about those critiques and come to your own conclusions.
And finally, remember that behaviorism gives us some amazing tools to understand and shape behavior. But like any tool, it can be used in good ways or bad ways. It's our job to make sure these tools are used responsibly, ethically, and to benefit everyone.
So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the world of behaviorism and the human mind. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.